Rehana is my guest today on Future Cities Africa. She's founder and owner at the Barefoot Facilitator and a past member of the Mayoral Committee of the City of Johannesburg. Rehana, welcome. For those who don't know you, tell us a bit more about your background and your current work at the Barefoot Facilitator.
Thanks, Daniel, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you in this conversation. So my professional background is actually a far cry from a lot of other work I've done. I'm trained as an educator, teacher of English and history, actually, but then went into a long stint of community activism as I was raising my young children. And that kind of led me to local government, initially as a proportional representation councillor in the City of Johannesburg, and then later in 2006, appointed by Mayor Masondo as the member of the Mayoral Committee responsible for transport in the City of Johannesburg. Resigned from, well, had that position for one term and then a bit of the next term, but resigned from that in 2013. And now run my own company, really focused on opening authentic conversation, both in public sector, private sector, and between public sector and community. So really bringing a lot of my community activism experience, my government experience, my teaching experience together into an offering that shifts the way people interact and engage with each other on the big issues around city making and so forth.
So let's jump into the first question, and that would be with regards to stakeholder collaboration, because that's one of the things that you're trying to encourage and get going. What do you think are some of the key challenges in South Africa with regards to public and private sector working together towards a common vision, especially on transport?
So Daniel, I think part of the challenge in the way I've understood it, just from the various places that I've worked in and the work that I do, is that often the way in which the systems are structured for partnerships and collaboration tends to be a very tick box exercise. And we miss the opportunity to have real and authentic conversations with each other and move the agendas forward in the interest of those who use systems, whether those be public transport systems or non-motorized transport infrastructure interventions, that we have these as very academic exercises. We look at how we do integrated development plans, integrated transport plans, often very consultant driven. And of course, not having anything against consultants, but I think when we miss the interface with user voice and user perspective, we miss a whole chunk. So often many of those, whether they're in public sector or private sector, who are planning for our urban spaces are doing so from the luxury of a private vehicle, have little to no inkling of what it's like to walk in our cities, to cycle in our cities, to use public transport in our cities, and are then coming up with interventions that essentially miss the mark of what it is we're trying to do. And that often the focus is on the mode or the solution that is coming without really understanding what it is that we're trying to solve. So, my sense is that often these conversations are very academic, very theoretical, very desktop in their nature. Of course, we're now living through a particular period in time, but I think just, from my period in the City of Johannesburg through to the work that I do now, just how do people arrive as their whole selves in the work they do? And so, one of the things that resonates for me, Daniel, is when I started in the City of Johannesburg, knowing, as I've said to you from my background, knowing little to nothing about transport planning, transport engineering, my immediate reference point was to go back to my own life experiences in relation to transport. and how those had shaped my understanding of the world. And it became very apparent to me very quickly that mobility and access to mobility is, firstly, it's a life cycle issue, all the way from how a pregnant mum gets to her checkups and gets to a birthing experience and the first trip made home with a child, right through to how one's final bodily remains get to the last resting place. And right through that life cycle, in fact, your life is either enabled or disabled by access to mobility. And so often I think we have these conversations in very academic, theoretical ways without bringing the personal and lived experiences of people to how we plan these systems.
So if you had a magic wand and tomorrow you could get the right people around the table to discuss this and move the industry forward, what would you do? What would that agenda be like, and who would you invite to that table?
That's an interesting question. So Daniel, I think that's exactly the point, right? Is that there are no magic wands and there are no quick fix solutions to these conversations. But I think if, irrespective of who has to be at the table at a particular point, our ability to deeply listen to where the other party is coming from. But often, I mean, if you look at kind of specifically the public transport experience in South Africa, often it's kind of government on one side of the table, usually the minibus taxi sector and the bus industry on the other side of the table. And that conversation is going to and fro with little to no voice for the actual users of these systems. And whether we bring, I mean, of course, ideally the users should always be in the conversation and at the table. But whether we bring them into the room or not, how do we constantly keep the user experience in mind when we decide and design solutions for our cities? So I think, bringing empathy, bringing deep listening, bringing generative conversations. So often we're stuck in our positions. And I mean, certainly in the Johannesburg experience, and now I don't want to talk, Daniel, about the system. I don't want to talk about Rea Vaya, but I want to talk about the process of engagement with the minibus taxi sector, which, quite honestly, I don't think enough people have taken the time to understand what happened in that process, irrespective of, whether you think the investment was the right one. Many people writing now about a failed system and so forth. I believe the jury's still out on that, and it's very early days. But there are deep lessons in that process of conversation and learning together that happened, and actively investing in study tours, in change management, in authentic conversation, and in respecting the leadership of the minibus taxi sector in the city at the time, and working with them as co-creators of a solution rather than just receivers of a government plan. And I think there were deep learnings in that process, which unfortunately I don't think enough people who've written and analyzed the systems have taken the time to understand that journey.
You were a key contributor to the National Land Transport Act of 2009. Do you think the NLTA met its objectives, or are there areas where you think it didn't quite reach its aim?
So Daniel, I mean, I'm not sure that certainly as Joburg, we would have influenced and tried to shift the direction of the NLTA as a city. And I mean, I think the levels of unnecessary contestation between spheres of government in the South African context around And of course, transport is one of those things that traverses all three spheres of government, and each has an entity that is actually an operator of a transport mode and all the complexity that comes with that. But I think, again, what Ria Vaya showed, and I think what the intention of the NLTA is, and I know that the amendment bill is now taking us further and further away from that vision of really the sphere of government closest to where people live, work, and play, being responsible for planning the urban fabric and environment together with citizens for how things should unfold in an area. I think we have unnecessary contestation between spheres of government. I think COVID has been interesting in beginning to show us on the need for a whole of government approach to everything we do. And I think the siloed, both horizontal, so within cities, and then vertical between spheres of government, the siloed approach to just government, we're not even talking bringing in private sector or civil society. If you look at that siloed approach, often driven by quite frankly, high egos and high levels of egos driving the discussion, and who controls budget, and who makes decisions, is all fairly unnecessary. And some work that I've been doing separately since I've stepped out of government, coming from Otto Scharmer at MIT with the Presencing Institute, and the notion of how do you move from ecosystems to ecosystems. And transport is an ecosystem, as is so much of other parts of what happens in cities. And that, for me, needs an internal shift in people who have to be deeply present, rather than the current, you're physically present, but actually the rest of you is absent from these decisions, these conversations, these pieces of policy. I think our policies are generally well-intended. What happens from policy formulation to implementation, and the gap in people's presence in how they move from policy formulation to implementation, and the absencing of their whole selves. So I think many people come with a very head-based approach to the work we're doing and leave their hearts behind, sometimes leave their hands behind, so the stuff sits on paper and never actually manifests into anything. But I do believe that there are many well-intentioned people. The system, however, measures and rewards a lot of the wrong behaviors, measures and rewards silo thinking, measures and rewards departmental approaches rather than whole systems approaches to the work we're doing. And personally, I've chosen to put my energy into the work of shifting individuals with the view to shifting systems. And that's really the work that the Barefoot Facilitator is doing at the moment. I do some work with the South African Cities Network, and I'm particularly linked to their Built Environment Integration Task Team, which is a group of practitioners from across metropolitan municipalities, either in the planning or strategy function in municipalities, but with a large responsibility for issues of the built environment. And in fact, what we've done with this team is decided to create a journey rather than this notion of once-off events, where we work over a period of time on shifting individuals with the view to shifting system and practice. We, through that work, have created a board game, which we launched just pre-COVID, called Setopoly. And Setopoly is really an attempt to show that we are very busy in South African cities, building institutional compliance at the expense of society. and that we have a tendency, our practitioners have a tendency to be looking upward to politicians as opposed to outward to communities. And in fact, in 2 weeks' time, we're running, so we've been doing a COVID-19 series online on issues that practitioners in cities wanted to talk about. And in 2 weeks, we're turning that into a virtual festival. But let me just say that, the whole notion of smart cities in itself, and I think for South African cities, this issue of everyone coming to South Africa with, we have the solution for a challenge that you're facing, whether that solution is in the mobility space, whether it's in the innovation space. And often, I mean, quite frankly, behind the proposals that are being offered is a massive monetary gain for whatever system you're trying to sell. And in fact, coming with this notion of magic wand solutions to challenges. And I think part of what needs to happen is to build the confidence of both South African politicians and practitioners across spheres of government to know that smart is not necessarily a technology solution, that in fact, smart is the inbuilt intelligence that we inherently have if we stop, pause, and note what we're actually being called to do at a moment in time. And I think as you've indicated, the notion of smart in relation to, we haven't been smart as a species, which has gotten us to where we are as a collective in relation to climate change and other things. Of course, we think we're very smart. And part of my work is really about moving people from a mind and head-based solution into a heart-based solution that moves into the hands and still uses the head. I'm not saying discard the head space. But, there's been scientific evidence through the Institute of Heart Math and other people that have worked in proper lab conditions that have shown the intelligence fields of the heart. And so, I do believe that smart cities will evolve when, if in fact, we stop and breathe and connect with our own intelligence for the challenges that we collectively face. So that's one piece of work. The second piece of work that I'm involved with that speaks again to your issue around collaboration and partnerships is National Treasury through the City Support Program have a program called Partnering for Inclusive Growth. We had run an initial round of this. It really comes from World Bank thinking around competitive cities and what gives them the edge. But we very much tailored that program for South African conditions. And again, what it requires is for different parts of the system to consciously come into a partnering exercise and a collaboration approach, knowing that we don't have to agree on everything. So there's a book that's done by Adam Kahani of Rios Partners called Collaborating with the Enemy, How to Work with People You Don't Agree With, Like, or Trust. And the first step is really just step into the game, the willingness to step into the unknown. And I think in many instances, we've worked on this notion that you have to have the full game plan before you're willing to start, as opposed to this notion of let's step in, let's work together, let's find the journey together. And I think the fact that our whole world is in this period and beyond going to fundamentally transform is going to mean that the regular way of working and the kinds of events and conferences you've talked about, which I now almost blankly refuse to be a part of, because really we just meet and there's lots of talk and a declaration at the end of it. And the way in which we have conversations, I might leave there never knowing that, Daniel had a car crash, that Daniel was in London, fell in love, met a girl, changed his life trajectory. We don't have those conversations. We don't interact as human beings. And really, increasingly this notion of that there are tons of people out there who want to be part of a conscious community that begins to shift the built environment, the economic system, the ecological system, but nothing shifts on the outside until we don't create the shifts on the inside. And so, just really saying that we spend tons of money on things that really don't create or take us further in creating the kind of society we all want. Nobody wants more of what we currently have collectively created.
Talking about future cities, is your picture for future cities optimistic, or are you a bit scared?
So Daniel, I think I'm always an optimist. And I think that this period of COVID is laying bare everything that's wrong with our cities. It is amplifying and exacerbating inequality, poverty, lack of wellness, lack of secure food supply, the lack of urban food systems, what we've done to the environment. And I guess a lowly virus is getting us all to stop, to pause, to reflect. And I think it would be very sad if post-COVID, we continue on the trajectory that we were prior to the arrival of COVID. So as difficult as this period is, I think there's a gift in slowing it down, creating almost silent, reflective spaces to think about our individual agency, our collective agency, to fundamentally transform the places and spaces we call cities, to make them more inclusive. I think the interesting thing about COVID as a virus is that all of those barriers that we've created of class, of race, of gender, of sexual orientation, the virus has just said, I deal with everyone. And so it must be that in the midst of the pain and the anguish that we collectively feel for our lack of control, actually, that we must come out of this experience humbled, and we must come out of this experience willing to do many things better and differently beyond this crisis.
So what is your view on the biggest challenge that must be overcome for future cities to be movable, and how would you solve that?
So lockdown is very instructive, and this period of COVID is very instructive. Because in fact, mostly what we're being asked to do is not be mobile, under the notion of the virus doesn't move, it's people that move, right? And inherent in this period then is the gift of the reminder of just how important mobility actually is. Because of course we can meet, and we're meeting virtually, and many of us are really enjoying digital and virtual meetings. But we're also realizing that we move to be with our loved ones. We move to go to spaces that fulfill us and enhance us. And even if you can bring me that space on a screen, there's something tangibly lacking about my ability to be in a space with others, in a physical space, in a physical connection with others. And I think it's reminding us that in many cases, as I said earlier in the life cycle discussion, that mobility is either an enabler or a disabler for people to fulfill their highest potential. And so we must see mobility as not about mode and not about competition. We must begin to understand the opportunities that mobility opens for an experience or denies or shuts down for people. And so I think my greatest hope is that we begin to think about and plan mobility in ways that really deepen our understanding of what we're doing. And I mean, I think that the issue around the amount of infrastructure in our cities that is dedicated to a one-person, one-car culture, and the space that our cars take up in our cities and across our urban spaces, and the fact that for many of us, our cars have been sitting idle, batteries running flat in this period, is a reminder of we need mobility. We don't necessarily need to own a vehicle to be able to move. And that in fact, some of the most liberating forms of movement are the ability to walk and breathe and use our senses. And I mean, interestingly, like COVID taking away that sense of smell, but when you walk in a city, what is it that you smell? What is it that you see? What is it that you hear? What are the sounds? How do we begin to interact with city making and space making with all of our senses? A colleague of mine at Cities Network has been busy in this period with visualization studios. And what's been interesting is the extent to which people have actually asked for silent spaces, spaces where they can just be. And I think we sometimes forget in questing for cities as these 24-hour places that constantly move, that never sleep, that in questing for that notion of a city, we're actually going against the laws of nature. And how do we begin to build cities that are a lot more in harmony with natural laws, where people have the opportunity to be more in contact with the natural environment? But of course, we all do every day if we just step out and look at the sky, irrespective of where we might be living. To understand our water systems and the potential challenges that are coming around water scarcity, and that we don't see these as crises and then we kind of default back to the way that we really shift completely the way in which we engage. And personally, my view is that we actually have to begin to create the circles of connection between individuals, the family unit, the community, the city, the province, the country, and the globe. And knowing that the local and the universal are actually a lot more connected than we understand. And inherent is this in this period is the opportunity to know that we are both local and global simultaneously, and that we have the opportunity to shift the way in which we move. And for me, it's really about the affordability of transport systems and mobility systems. And the fact that for most people, their life reality is curtailed by the fact that they just cannot afford to move. But the interesting thing about this period is no matter what your bank balance is, you still can't fly. You still can't head off to another country. You are currently grounded. And I'm hopeful that we can really begin to shift how we share space, how we allocate space in our cities, the freedom that comes with kind of streets that are actually accessible to all. So I'm not sure if you've ever heard of something called the Bernard van Laar Foundation. They run a project called Urban 95. And what it is about what does your city look like from the perspective of the height of a 95 centimeter height, which is the average height of a 3-year-old, okay? You know, so often our city making is about those who are young and athletic and able to get around. We don't think about the gogo or the mum with a pram or the person in a wheelchair. We don't think about city making from, you know, what does a skyscraper look like when you're 95 centimeters high? And how do you feel when you need to cross a street with speeding cars when you're 95 centimeters high? And there might not be an adult at your side to help you to navigate that space. So I hope we begin to think about mobility as a much more human activity, that these are about people who need to go and buy food, or who need to access education, or who are going down the road to meet a loved one. And that's why they need to move, and to begin to think about the reasons why people move, and then design the mobility system to respond not only to our own needs, because I think the other thing that has gotten cities into the mess we are is that we've elevated our needs over and above the needs of the natural environment, what it's able to give, how much we should be taking from it. And we need to rebalance all of those things. So I think it would be incredibly sad if post-COVID we say, we just want to go back to the way we used to do things. We have the opportunity to breathe with all other living things around us and to give them the respect that they deserve, even in an urban environment.
Not getting your magic wand this time, but let's get a time machine. What do cities look like in 20 years' time with regards to mobility, the way people move around, technologies that might be playing a big role? How do you see cities in 20 years' time?
I hope that we have more human cities. I listened to an interesting talk the other day that shared how all of this technological innovation was meant to free us up as human beings so that we could do the things that deeply matter to us. But in fact, we've just been on this treadmill like hamsters, just running. So of course, you know, I think technology will evolve as technology does. There will probably be drones and who knows. But I hope that ultimately what we have is much deeper human connection and mobility systems that give dignity, that give respect, and that are available and affordable to all, so that mobility doesn't become the reason why you don't realize your potential, that our mobility systems enable people to access each other and opportunity in the way they need to. But I think importantly that mobility is only one component of the broader urban fabric. And the way in which we stop to greet each other, the way in which we use our public spaces, that we just slow it down a tad. There's no need to be rushing around for what? I think this period has shown us that with all the rushing around, there's not much to show. There's nothing we can do. And so, you know, irrespective of what modes evolve, and hopefully we will have, you know, that vision of an integrated, affordable, accessible, dignified transport system. But it's not about the transport system. It's really about how we choose to meet each other in those spaces. So you might have encountered, there have been two pieces recently. I can't remember the name, but a very famous musician in the UK who went into the subway station, and, you know, normally to access his concerts would cost a fortune. And he played for, I think, over an hour in the subway station. And the only person who actually really noticed was a little child. Everyone else just rushed past. And then I think more recently, there was a soccer player who did a similar thing, kind of disguised himself and then was kind of kicking around a ball, and very few people actually realized who he was. And I hope we have mobility systems where we actually see each other, where we make the effort as we travel together to truly see the next human being. So when, you know, when we greet with the Sanibonani or Sawubona, that we know that it's saying, I see you, I acknowledge you, I know that we're sharing a train or a plane or a taxi, but that we do it as fellow human beings, hopefully cognizant of what our mobility choices mean for the broader environment.